Good morning and welcome to the Harmonize Mobility Monetizing the Curb in the Age of Automation webinar. My name is Jerry Boyer, co-founder and chief operating officer of Harmonize Mobility, and I am pleased to be your host today. Thanks for being with us. I think you're going to love the topic today, monetizing the curb. Before we get started, I'll take care of a few housekeeping items. Firstly, we are scheduled to end in 1 hour and we'll do our best to honor that commitment. If you have questions, you can ask them by typing into the question box on the GoToWebinar control panel. And we'll do our best to answer all of your questions. And the webinar is being recorded. We're going to share the link with all registrants within the next couple of days. And I think that's all you need to know for now. So without any further ado, we are delighted to have Alana Coombs as our web panel moderator today. She's currently at USC Price School of Public Policy working on the impact of autonomous vehicles on downtowns. In addition to her academic career, she's also a practitioner. Her last job before leaving London was the City of London Corporation, where she led the Smart City program and led on the transport and design strategic planning policies. Alana has also been a town centre downtown manager for London Borough of Sutton and for Epsom in Surrey, and you can ask her about salt if you want in the question panel, if you remember how to use the question panel. Okay, so without any further ado, on to you, Alana. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. We've got an excellent lineup of speakers that I'm very pleased about. I've carefully chose them, really, not just because they're experts in their subject area and very experienced, but also because they're very interesting speakers as well. Just a word on the format of things. So they're going to speak, each one will speak for 8 minutes. And then at the end of each presentation, there'll be 2 minutes to answer any burning questions that you might have. And we might get some time at the very end to answer any other questions as well to any of the panel members. So just to mention as well that when you do put questions in, please do mention your affiliation as well as your name when you do that. So before we move to our presentations, Bern, could I ask you just to give us the briefest of explanation of what this ISO standard 4448 is all about and what it has to do with monetizing the curb?
Sure, happy to do that. Give me the first slide, please. The next slide. Thanks, Helena. So I've just prepared a few slides to at very high level capture the reasons for the standard, and I will show a tiny bit about how it's put together, but it won't be very detailed. That's to leave room for the rest of the panel. So really, there's multiple reasons to develop a standard for real-time operations of vehicles at the curb, and soon on the sidewalk as well. The variety of modes and uses and sheer numbers at the curb and sidewalk are growing, and that's even ignoring the current upset from the pandemic. That was already growing before then. It will continue to grow throughout and after. But today, this includes, on the left of this, things like parking and bus stops, and there's also growing space and access demands for ride hailing, cycling, e-commerce, scooters, bike shares. I think we all know all those things that are putting increasing demands on the curb. And now there's even, in many areas, temporarily, I guess, al fresco dining space as restaurants move out to take some of the curb space as well. And we're expecting soon, we don't know when, things like robo-taxis and automated trucks and sidewalk delivery bots and so forth. So all of that, including even things like sweeping debris and snow, possibly automated, possibly in the next few years, throughout all of this coming changes that are coming up. So all of this requires coordination among many operators, many purposes and tasks, as well as safety and livability matters, as we are humans and pedestrians and people on wheelchairs and bicyclists and so forth, amongst all of these changes. And so automation is expected to change how municipalities will monetize the curb. We might lose, Today, that's parking fees and fines and various forms of registrations and operating license. Yet one assumption is that we might lose a lot of that over the next many years. And so we need some kind of a structure to address that change in monetization, and that is the focus of today's panel. Next slide, please. So today we think about managing the curb in three aspects. This is, very simplistically. On the left, we need to map, or we use the expression code to curb. We need to know where things are. What's where. In the center, we need to decide how this will be used and monetized. That's the job of planners and city councils. On the right, we need to keep all of this operating as planned. And this gets complicated and varies from district to district and city to city. And today this, quote, operating system, quote, means signs and fines for enforcement, police departments, and even, sadly, a traffic court system for final settlement. So it's a very complex operating system, and that, next slide, will, as automated vehicles are deployed, that will not hold up. As the automated vehicles are deployed, the activities of mapping and governing the curb change only in their detail on the left and center, but the real change comes in the actual operation. In addition to recognizing space for a large number of human activities, as well as signs and fines for human operated machines, we need data, connectivity, protocols, and a logistics style ground control system. And we'll hear something about that from Simon later, already in some places. We need that to manage priorities, reservations, queuing, and the like for both automated and non-automated vehicles. So the way we operate the curb now will not work. It's already not really working that well, and it will seriously not work as we begin to bring automated devices. So next slide. Thank you. The standard under development deals with these operational things on that last, what you saw on the right on the previous slide. And we must consider also safety, the mixing of automated and non-automated vehicles, and it has to enable and guide policy with planning, and it has to do that without dictating local specifics. We may hear something about that from OJ a little later, because there are cultural and local and municipal reasons that things are done the way they're done, and the standard needs to allow for those without dictating them, because it's an international operational standard. So systems of governance and maintenance for the sidewalk and curb of the future will need greater diligence and considerable funding compared to today as well, because it's a more complex and finely tuned and finely managed environment. So this will require revenue, and we think monetization will be critical to making all of this work. Again, hence today's panel. Last slide, please. At the highest level, and this is, I'm just going to do this very briefly. At the very highest level along the top rank, there's a total of 4 parts to the standard, and the top level is part 1. The first, the full suite of data and protocols and structures needed for this activity. Then once that full set of protocol and data are in place, which is, we're sort of about halfway through that, or almost halfway through that now, we are building 3 more parts to the standard. Part 2 is the protocols, the actual protocols at the curb, again with the ability to manipulate and scale that for local purposes. The third part is for the sidewalk. Think about the automated drones and automated wheelchairs and so forth. And the fourth part is integrating those together, sidewalk and curb, and that's because there will be some systems we expect where goods are brought to the curb in a larger vehicle and released with drones in a smaller vehicle, for example. It's also the case that we need to have protocols for cleaning, sweeping, snow removal, and so forth. So those are the 4 parts of the standard. I can't go further than that now. What I can do is I can answer any questions after the panelists are done toward the end if there's time, and I'm also completely and certainly happy to invite to respond in any more detail. If you reach out to me, the emails are available to you. Happy to answer detailed questions. Thanks, Alana.
Great, thanks, Bern. So Bern has referred to some of the changes afoot that will put pressure on the curbside. But what are those pressures, and what should we be prepared to expect in the future at the curbside? To answer some of these questions, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, who is the Chief Executive of the UK and Republic of Ireland's Association of Town and City Management, which represents a broad range of town centre managers and business improvement districts and other people who care about downtown. And our speaker really has been quite instrumental, really, in making the ATCM a very respected voice within Parliament in the UK and also with other policymakers as well. So joining us from London, a huge welcome to OJ McDonald.
Thank you very much, Lana. That's really kind words. And I have to say, it's such a great topic to pick because it could not be more pertinent right now in terms of what's happening in the UK. So for everybody out there, I'm just going to give you a little flavour of what's happening in the UK, and you'll understand just right now how important the curbside is and how premium that space is at the moment. So can I have the first slide, please? Oh, sorry, next slide, Alana.
I think I've got a slow connection here.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Okay.
So the story starts for us. What you can see here is a picture of Canary Wharf. The story starts for us about 13 years ago when we had a major financial meltdown, and I'm reliably informed that on the other side of the big pond, you guys call this the Great Recession. And what this did was really to suck the funding out from local government. So after we'd finished bailing out our banks, a lot of whom are based in Little Manhattan or Canary Wharf, local government was left, our municipalities was left with 60% less funding than they would usually use to support their communities, which was really challenging for them. They were really compelled to much more commercially about how they generate revenue. Next slide, please. And what this meant was they looked at the different ways in which they generate revenue. And I think some of the things are things that we know well. So things like the use of retail street markets from businesses, so businesses could use that place, but especially things like car parking on a curbside. It was something that has really helped us to supplement some of those local government offers. Next slide, please. Now, I think moving on from there, some of the things which really now challenge those traditional models of making money are the things which we know about. They've already been mentioned: autonomous vehicles, how that changes something like the parking industry, the transportation of goods using urban airspace for drones, we're talking about all the time, and wondering how that will impact our towns and cities, and also changes in consumer behaviour and the ability to do much more with our software, allowing the creation of car sharing apps, which has meant car sharing has become much more popular. So in terms of that use of the curbside by vehicles, you know, that is under threat, but as yet there's not been a lot of strategic planning around that. However, these particular trends have been completely superseded by some other things which have really changed the game. Next slide, please. So firstly, climate change. That's had a really big impact on our thinking about how to use the curbside. We now have energy companies vying for position for their EV charging units on curbside, which has become, you know, a really interesting dynamic, and is happening right across the country. And that's in response to 2 or 3 years of severe flooding we've had across the UK. Next slide, please. And then that's also sort of dovetails with this growth in technology and the different data companies almost vying for position, sometimes exactly the same infrastructure, especially in terms of lampposts, in the installation of small cell 4G, but also now moving on to 5G. And that's become a real battle for the public realm from various data companies that want their into those lampposts. There's been a lot of discussion from our big telecommunications company, BT, which used to stand for British Telecom, around the exclusive agreements between communications companies and municipalities, and looking to try and open that up to make sure it's all open source data, which anybody's able to use. But that's a debate which is currently ongoing. Next slide, please. But none of those trends compare quite to what is happening at the moment, and that is the challenge which has been posed by COVID-19. So the major challenge we have at the moment is simply that a lot of our businesses are just not viable if they can only trade within their premises. Our bars and our restaurants now need space more than ever. So literally within the last couple of weeks, the UK government for England has changed the rules, have brought forward the Business and Planning Act in England to allow our hospitality businesses to trade outdoor in the public realm using curbside space. So I'm just going to talk you through some very quick examples. Next slide, please.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble moving the slide. Okay.
Click on the PowerPoint icon, Alana.
I've moved it now.
Fabulous. So the first example, it comes from Camden, and it's called Streetery, where bars and restaurants have been able to spread out, and that's now up and running, and it seems to be really successful, and it's allowing those bars and restaurants to trade both safely and profitably. Next slide, please. And also this is a design from the wonderful city of Liverpool. They're calling their scheme Liverpool Without Walls, where they put in these lovely parklets just outside restaurants, using up parking bays, pedestrianising streets, and allowing people to sit outside. Next slide, please. And then Brixton has come up with this idea of the Brixton Playground. Again, pedestrianisation, getting rid of all the cars and looking at how those businesses can use that space, dominate that space, to be able to allow people to enjoy whatever those businesses have to offer safely in an outdoor environment where there's less chance of transmission. And the final slide, please, Alana. But I think that the way this is done is ultimately that the licenses for those businesses have been made much, much cheaper than they would have been. And now that the licenses for the businesses are so cheap, the cost of it doesn't even allow the municipalities to cover the costs of processing some of those applications. So the question is, can we benefit financially from income from our curbside space in the UK? Absolutely, we can. The opportunities are there, whether it's energy companies, data companies, whether it's the hospitality businesses, we can generate income, but it's who will benefit financially from that income, and what the legacy of this pandemic will be. But certainly right now that space is at a premium, and I don't think municipalities are necessarily the front runners to benefit from some of the opportunities that are out there. That's it from me.
Thanks very much, OJ. And I'm very sorry if there was a bad connection there. It's terribly slow for me. So I am sorry, OJ. I seem to have a delay, particularly when I change slides. Could I ask Jerry? Jerry, do we have any questions, burning questions for OJ?
Yeah, so first of all, let's just acknowledge we did run into a little bit of technical challenge there, and we missed some of what you were saying, OJ, because our technology was lagging. So I actually shut off everybody's video except for yours, and that seemed to deal with the problem. So everybody on the call, we're really sorry about that, and we're definitely going to ask OJ to come back another time to present even more on this topic. So let me just jump into the questions here. So there's a lot of comments about obviously the audio feed was messed up there. So let me see this. So the public realm conversation. How has the public sector worked to manage that access? Here in DC, there has been significant pressure for tapping into our street and traffic poles, contrasting with public security concerns, public space clutter. Yeah, so your comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's different in every area. So every municipality has its own way of dealing with the regulation and maintenance of its curbside space. And it becomes more complicated in the UK because we have different levels of municipality that sometimes overlap, and sometimes it's not even the municipality. So just to give you an example, we have town councils, district councils, unitary authorities, the highways authorities, who all may have different roles in terms of managing that curbside space. And so it can be a real challenge, because even within our local government structures, you can find different bodies competing with each other for some of that revenue. So in any one town, you could literally have one part of your local government that manages the actual on-street car parking, which is your curbside space, but a different part of local government managing the off-street car parking, and there being a real disconnect there. And so we have lots of challenges, and there's no one clear answer to that particular question. And I just wonder if, given the shakeout now from this pandemic, if we will see much more collaboration across our different authorities to come together to work much better and in unison to create a sort of unified vision for the use of that curbside. And that's certainly what I'm seeing in certain parts of the country. People are working together much more easily to manage that space.
Great, thanks OJ. So we've seen some of the current and some of the future pressures on the curbside. But how does regulation and pricing fit into this? And does regulation and pricing even matter? To answer some of these questions, we'll turn now to our next speaker, who until recently was the mobility lead for Sidewalk Labs, and in previous roles has held senior economist and transit jobs. So has got a perspective from a tech company as well as from government as well. So joining us from Toronto, a huge welcome to Andrew Miller.
Thank you, Alana. It is a pleasure to be here and to speak to you all about curbside regulation and thriving cities. So first slide, please. So my opening remarks, I'm going to paraphrase, I think, largely what Bernd said as an introduction, is that what it is that makes a thriving city, among the things that makes a thriving city, is the ability for people and goods to move freely within it. So it's hard to track the number of auto trips within a city. So I used as a proxy the city I know best in Toronto. You can see here on the above line is trips taken on the Toronto Transit Commission, the TTC, for up to the last year for which we've got good data. And below that is Toronto GDP. You can see the slope of the two lines is pretty much identical. Both are growing at more or less 2.4% a year. And we understand why that is. There's a direct relationship between movement of goods and trips within the city and urban economic activity. As economic activity increases, so too do trips within the city. And if you hamper one of those variables, then the other is going to be hampered as well. Next slide, please. There is a lot of potential for hampering in our current environment. So Right now, we already have competition at the space between auto lanes, bike or slow mobility lanes, pedestrian space, surface transit dedicated lanes and stops. But we also got to deal with parking spaces, loading spaces with the rise of Uber and other ride-hail companies, pickup and drop-off spaces, bike share, scooter share docking stations. And that's to say nothing of the pressures that COVID-19 has introduced: patio space, more pedestrian space for adequate social distancing, food app delivery. You can see in these photos the number of different uses that are happening at the curb. All of these uses in a democratic polity need to be accommodated. That is tricky to do, so therefore cities quite rightly regulate and price their curbs. Next slide, please. With famous results, and this is a sign from New York City. Trying to manage the competing demands for the curb is tricky, and it's going to become worse. As Bern suggested at the beginning, taxi bots are coming. Sidewalk delivery drones are going to come sooner than that. And my favorite, I think before we even get those, what we're going to get is autonomous scooters, where you press a button on your phone and a scooter rolls up. It's a tri-wheeled scooter. It rolls up to you at the curbside so that you can take it on a trip. It isn't autonomous. It's being piloted by someone overseas, you know, in Mumbai or something, who has got a camera app and views the city, pilots the scooter to you, lets you use it, and then pilots it back to a docking station. That is going to be happening soonest of all. So trying to find space for all these uses of the curb is going to be tricky. COVID has slowed down near-term deployment of all these technologies, so it's not going to happen in the next 24 months. But even as COVID has slowed down the near term, it's accelerated the long term. Capital, the pools of capital have noticed there is demand for interacting with the city in such a way that you don't need to have direct contact with other people. So scooters, autonomous scooters, taxi bots, they're all coming, and they're going to come sooner than we might think in the long term, thanks to reallocation of capital because of COVID. Next slide. So what should cities do about this? The iron rule for mobility or infrastructure investment in a city context is, or should be, infrastructure is expensive, software is cheap. Or put another way, computer chips before concrete. Moving stuff around in the physical space is really expensive and time consuming and disruptive. And that is only going to increase over time. Whereas software, building software and rolling out software gets it gets cheaper over time. Code is fast and inexpensive. Code can be copied, so you can scale it up fast and cheap. So this rule, combined with the central, what I would argue is the central technological development of the past 20 years, is that sensors are now powerful and cheap. So thank your mobile phone for that. Now cameras are cheap to make and are very, very powerful. Add to that cloud computing. Combine the triple threat of cheap sensors, cheap cloud computing and processing, and cheap code. What you get is it is very, very simple to deploy cameras and automated regulation. There's nothing better. We really have a perfect storm for the deployment of dynamic regulation, monitoring, and enforcement of the proper use of public assets. So I would submit to you that the curb is going to be one of the first places that we see this happen, because there's a real problem that has to be solved there, namely competing uses, but there's also an opportunity. Next slide, please. That opportunity, of course, is that cities need revenue. They always have had needed revenue. They always have used curbside regulation to collect that revenue, but it is too expensive to deploy a parking enforcement officer on every street. So you have to set up signs and then move people around, and then people, when enforcement is irregular and uncertain, you get much more evidence of scofflaws. The new world, you can have constant enforcement and dynamic rollout of what curb regulation is. This is a revenue source both for fines, but also for consistent collection of all of those costs. So this is good in a narrow sense for cities because they will be able to have a more reliable revenue stream. But there's other reliability issues that this allows for. Namely, when you have consistent and ubiquitous pricing regimes, what you can do is consistent reduction of low value trips at the margins in favor of high value trips. I think this is well understood in terms of road tolls and congestion charges are excellent at shifting the limited resource of street space to the highest and best valued use. We can do the same thing with curbs. What is the consistently least valued but most common use of the curb? Well, it's long-term parking of vehicles. Again, this is supposition on my part, but I think it's well-grounded supposition. We're not going to be able to do much with pickup and drop-off ride hail in the near term, but what we can do is have much better enforcement, allocation and enforcement for loading zones or non-parking uses. Right now, you cannot reliably know if you are trying to deliver something in a downtown that you will have access to a space, and loading docks are famously inadequate and insufficient. People will pay for that use. It is a better use, higher value use, and ultimately more lucrative use than parking private vehicles. We're in a situation where we can do that. And of course, if to the extent that we reduce private parking of personal automobiles for the long term in cities, we discourage that use, which is also going to reduce pressure on all mobility networks in favor of more efficient things like transit or even ride hail. Next slide, last slide. The final point that I would make to this, and this comes last because it is more tentative. It may be that COVID has upended this apple cart. We won't know for another few years, but I think that what we might call the Florida thesis remains strong. So you all know Richard Florida, famous, he's Toronto-based thinker about what makes cities grow. The Florida thesis is the logic of economic geography. People want to move where there are firms that are hiring. Firms want to found where there are people that they want to hire. So one lever that cities have in order to encourage their growth is to create the sort of environment that attracts both high-value employees and high-value firms. What is a high-value firm? Well, there's lots of them, but let's stick to right now the idea of technological firms. That appears to be the golden spring of our age. Investing in urban technology like curbside management, dynamic curbside management, attracts firms that wish to found and expand, because this sort of investment is a strong signal that a city is future oriented, that it wants to take a chance on building things that are in the future. It attracts firms for that reason. It attracts various groups of workers for the same reason, the young, the wealthy, the higher educated. Both of those attractions mutually reinforce. So this sort of investment is a relatively cheap one that enables cities to set up their economic prosperity for the future. So, final slide. Where all this ends up with the 4448 ISO standard that Bern was discussing at the beginning is none of this can happen. None of this future curbside regulation can happen. None of the benefits I've described can accrue unless there is a universal standard first that will permit this to be done in a way that can be scaled up quickly across many, many cities. it's why I'm very excited by the fact that Bern is working on 4448. I think that there's a lot of promise in it. I will leave you with that. It's been a pleasure to speak to you today, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Jerry, do we have any questions, burning questions for Andrew?
So I have, we probably have time for one question from Benito Perez. His question is, what about automated payment use via transaction/location data of ride sourcing, TNCs in brackets, and freight activity? Any thoughts? Question.
Yes, it's a very, one of the things that you can do if you elaborate on the lines that I've described is you can set up APIs that can then communicate to any sort of app and can interface with them. So then you get sorts of things. This is something that at my former firm at Sidewalk Labs we were excited about, was the idea of you could integrate the rental cost for a pickup and drop off space into a ride hail app. So then the ride hail driver has the advantage of knowing exactly where they can pick up or drop off their person in such a way that they won't have to circle or wait or be any confusion. The rider knows exactly where to go to get that, and the city gets a guaranteed source of revenue. And it's admittedly fractional, it's in cents, but multiplied by the thousands of trips in a city a day, it becomes real money. Once you have an API that this sort of technology can produce, then what you get is a thriving ecosystem. So the future, after that, the world is your oyster. So that is where the blossom is, and the seed comes from, the seed is having dynamic curb regulation, which in turn depends on the technology, which in turn depends on the standard.
Great, thank you very much, Andrew. That's wonderful. So we've seen some of the key changes at the curbside, and we've also seen why regulation and pricing of the curb actually do really matter. But how might this work in practice? So what are some of the things that city government might need to take into account as they look to their curbside with an eye to making the most out of their assets? To respond to such questions, we move to our next speaker, who is widely seen as a world expert in designing, planning and launching new shared mobility ventures and programs. So joining us from Vancouver, a huge welcome to Sandra Phillips.
Thank you, Alana. I'm pleased to be here. I feel shared mobility is the first kind of group that has been curbed already by a lot of municipalities, and I will be sharing some of the learnings or examples, share some examples of what cities are currently doing with shared mobility. But before I do that, I just want to square away what exactly is shared mobility? What do I mean when I talk about shared mobility? So the SAE has released a standard earlier this year, and it defines it as the shared use of a vehicle, and it really doesn't matter what that vehicle is, whether it's a scooter, a bike, a bus, a car, that you give users access short term and when and if they need it. Which obviously means now you have a lot of different types of vehicles, small and big, scooters, mopeds, cars, buses, taxis, they all need access to that curb, and they already do. I'm sure we all remember the pictures of, scooters littered everywhere or dockless bikes piled up at transit stations. So what have cities done to curb this new form of transportation? And they've really looked at 5 different areas of how they regulate them. Alana, next slide, please. So the first one is obviously mobility, moving people around in the city with these new forms. The second one is parking and how you increase turnover, especially in commercial and entertainment district. Then how do you achieve some of your other goals, other transportation goals as cities, like sustainability or equity, and gaining insight into all this movement of these new forms of transportation. And then there's a revenue portion attached to that. Now, this looks very abstract. I will give an example for every single one of them to kind of share what that looks like right now. So if we move into the mobility piece, one of the most effective ways of, as Andrew has said, you know, our cars sit about 95% of the time. It's a colossal waste of space, really. So if you want to encourage a shift away from personally owned vehicles that sit most of the time into shared modes, which are generally have a much higher utilization, the easiest way to do that is co-locate them in something that's called mobility hub or mobility punk, depending on, you know, are you in North America or in Europe. Ultimately, you want as many options as you possibly can have, whether that's car sharing, scooter sharing, you know, pedestrian access, the bus stop, all co-located together. And I will say right now, for shared mobility providers, most of the time that space is taken away from the regular car and really make it a pain in the butt for your own personal vehicle to be parked somewhere, and reallocated to shared mobility for free in the majority of cases. Now you will see not all of it is free for shared mobility. And so if we move on to the next one, we'll move into how cities do price certain uses. So one of the nice things with shared mobility is that it increases commercial activity. So there's been on the bike share side, there's been a solid study out of New York University that came out in 2018, and it looked at, you know, what was commercial activity before City Bike was introduced and then a year after. And you can see it's very tiny, but you can see that it increased significantly. In fact, a lot of restaurant trips or restaurants were the big winners, essentially. We know this intuitively also from ride hailing, because there's been a lot of studies showing that there's too much, you know, ride hailing vehicles driving around in entertainment and commercial districts trying to pick up passengers. And so one of the cities that has done something around this to curb that in a certain way is the city of Vancouver. We've been laggards when it comes to allowing Uber and Lyft. We only got them at the beginning of this year, just before the pandemic hit, really. And that allowed the city of Vancouver to really think about how do they want to price ride hailing to discourage, you know, an increase of vehicles in the core where there's already a lot of congestion. And so what they did is they introduced a curbside congestion fee. So if you're in the core, if you get picked up in the core, your trip essentially costs 30 cents more, whether or not you picked up or drop off. It's just 30 cents more. Now, and this kind of leads me into the next point, they are allowing discounts, 50% for zero emission vehicles and then 100% for accessible vehicles, which really leads me into kind of the next area that cities are focusing on, which is how do you tie the pricing of the curb together with other goals? And so I'm bringing an example of Europe. Madrid has had a restricted access zone since 2018 for vehicles. So you're not allowed to enter that area with your own personal vehicle. Now, shared fleets are allowed, and if they're electric, they're free. So what has that done? Essentially, in Madrid, citizens have access to over 13,000 electric shared vehicles, anything from car share to moped to kick scooters. So really, the city of Madrid and other cities are doing that too, is using discounts on a restricted or on a pricing scheme to encourage a shift towards zero emission. And similarly to that, they also use discounts to increase equity. So one of the challenges is, if you move to the next slide, Alana.
Sorry for the and Sandra, could you just turn on your video if you wouldn't mind as well? Sorry.
Oh, I thought I was. Sorry, I thought you guys are controlling my video. Apologies for that.
Yes, we were.
I saw myself, so I didn't recognize. Apologies.
Thank you.
So how do you make equity? Essentially, one other challenge for cities is having some of these shared modes are really good at, you know, solving some of the first and last mile problem, but they'd like to, they tend to like to operate in, high density areas, which is often where there is already good transit coverage. So one of the things you can do, or cities have been doing, is discount. So for instance, the city of Calgary has introduced a tiered discount system for car share parking. And if car shares purchase downtown, it's more expensive than if they purchase further out where there are transit deserts, and the city of Calgary really wants alternative options for their citizens. And so the last point I want to make is the data piece, which Andrew has mentioned already. Bern also brought it up. One of the beautiful things with all these shared fleets is that they already have a plethora of data, because that's how they price their users. And so a very real example, again, I'm using my hometown because I'm intimately familiar with what they're doing. City of Vancouver has not allowed any car share vehicles, and we have, well, before Car2Go left, we had about 3,500. We're probably somewhere around 2,000 now. Anyway, they weren't allowed to park at meters. Last year, they opened that up and said, yes, a car share vehicle can be parked at a meter as long as it doesn't go over 2-hour limit. Problem is, Evo, which is a free-floating concept similar to Drive Now or Car2Go, that's a challenge because you never know when the next person picks the vehicle up. So they made a deal with the city and said, we'll share the data and we'll pick up the tab if it goes over to 2 hours. What that does on the city side, they all of a sudden have insight into, how often do these vehicles turn over, where are they parked, but also it allows for this fractional pricing. Granted, it's a tiny amount, but a lot of tiny amounts also make a big sum at the end of the day. So I want to leave you with 3 final thoughts when it comes to pricing and curbing, especially shared mobility. The value of the curb is not just monetary. It's really also an instrument to drive other goals, whether that's your sustainability, your equity goals. I have this kind of hierarchy. Personally owned cars, as I said, they sit 95% of the time. It's a colossal waste of space. So they should be taxed highest. And then shared mobility is kind of the second tier. And then obviously active transportation, people walking and biking, in most cases probably should be free. And the last piece I want to mention is if you want to keep shared modes in your city, so if you want car sharing, bike sharing to stick around in your city for the long term, you have to think of how you price them with a long-term vision. Extracting the most value, there is this little bit of a myth in the space that, all these shared mode, TNCs, Uber, Lyft, scooter share companies are big money business, and they really aren't. Anybody who knows providing service, transportation service to citizens, it's a razor thin margin if you're profitable at all. So if you want them to stick around, think about how you price them, not just to extract as much value as possible in the short term, but so they stick around for the long term. That's all I have to say. I'm always happy to chat shared mobility, whether or not it's curbside related. And if there's any burning questions, happy to take that right now.
Wonderful. Thanks for that, Sandra. That's really good. Jerry, I think we might have time for a very, very quick question for Sandra, if you have any burning ones.
Yes, right now we don't have any burning questions, and
okay.
Yeah, okay.
Wonderful. Okay, we'll move on then. And our next speaker is from a company called Park Unload, which is based in Barcelona. And Park Unload are really seen as one of the world's most advanced digital platforms for smart loading zones. So very much in the curb space. So what does this technology at Park Unload look like? And why have they been so keen to join up with Harmonize Mobility in the ISO standard? Really pleased to introduce our next speaker, Simon Hayes, who's the EU Market Development for Park Unload. Thank you, Simon.
Hi, everybody. Thanks to Harmonize Mobility and to Alana for organising this. I'll take the first slide, please. So Park Unload is very pleased to support TS 4448. I'm going to start with a couple of examples of smart delivery zones that already exist and then point to possible next steps. So these examples show operationally efficient curbsides that create value. And that's the main point here, that only when the city is actually creating value will it be able to expect to charge for curbside use. Next slide. My example one, okay. Example one dates from 2015, when Barcelona's municipal agent BSM won the 2015 EPA, that's the European Parking Association, Innovation Award for its Area DUM project. Area DUM, the abbreviation DUM, means urban goods distribution in Catalan. And this replaced a cardboard disc system that you can see on the picture, leading to a range of operational improvements. The innovation was also about how the user community, the transport operators, were involved in the service deployment. The rules did not change. There was still up to 30 minutes free of charge for unloading on the street in these loading zones. But the use of the app was made mandatory under the revised traffic ordinance or bylaw. Next slide, yeah, great. The investment in Area DUM was part of Barcelona's integral street management plan. This has been evolving through the years. And what I'm noting here is that there was a substantial warden deployment back post 2000, when the residence parking scheme was introduced to effectively control what we heard from the last speaker. Personal mobility on the street is what cities are trying to control and reduce. Having the warden force meant that they were able to observe the unloading spaces. Sorry, I'm not quite finished. And then support the deployment of the Area DUM back in 2015. Okay, next slide, please. So also the previous speaker was saying about the value of data, and France particularly has some rules by which cities are obliged to collect data about urban freight movements. And this costs a hell of a lot. I think we can all agree, let's not try and debate how much it's actually worth now, but data is king is probably a phrase we all agree with. So these are some figures from the analyses that we did in the Novolog project, analyzing the data. You can see on the left side the hotspots, so you can actually find out which of the loading zones are really being used. And what you're seeing on the other side there is that the city then, for the first time, was able to know that there are between 40 and 45,000 operations a day over the 2,000 zones of the city. So that's nearly 1 million operations a month. Obviously, the data that they've got allows a much greater precision than if they'd done a one-off survey. Next slide, please. Yeah, my second example is from 2018, and it concerns the city of Vic, which is 70 kilometers north of Barcelona, with a population of about 50,000 inhabitants. And Vic was looking to resolve the conflicting demands on the perimeter of the pedestrianised historic centre. It designed a set of rules not only for the logistics operators making deliveries, also for local traders and persons with reduced mobility. So this became DUMA, and here the A is the Catalan for other curbside uses. So again, DUMA is an integral street management scheme, but in this case, it was established using a small team of civic wardens for enforcement, and it is standalone and not part of an on-street parking contract. Various operational efficiencies are identified. You can't see all the details on the screen. I can send you the slides. But as we're talking about monetization today, I have highlighted that the penalty fine revenues within the first 2 months exceeded the costs of deploying the scheme and developing the scheme. Okay, so how does DUMA work? In fact, the big sign on the right is very similar to that in Barcelona. It's got a digital code, and the sign communicates a mandatory use of the app. Again, there's no charge for use, and the bylaw has been implemented to make it mandatory use. In this case, the maximum stay time is variable. This enables the different user groups to have different sets of rules. Perhaps the biggest difference is the Bluetooth device on the back of the sign. This radically changes the way that the app interacts with the driver, making it much easier to use. You just confirm the request to use. There's no manual entry of the zone code. Also, a countdown is established, and you can see the app there with the sequence from green, amber, red as the driver gets a countdown of the time left, and this helps them to also check out. Yeah, it's an IoT system on a Microsoft Azure cloud platform. The city planners and the enforcement agents, they see the data in real time in the back office. They get the stage zone occupancies, stage duration statistics, and a lot of other stuff about the engine types, electric vehicles, or level of emissions of the vehicles using the space. Lots of things that are interesting to planners as well as data modelers. So again, the point about investing for valuable data is the same as for Barcelona, but more so. I think that the DUMA case 2 is a lot smarter than the DUM case 1, if you follow me. Yeah, we've participated since 2019 in enhancing further the user interface. Voice and click button interfaces have been successfully piloted in last mile delivery challenges managed by Smart Dublin. And I got a couple of next step things. One is that we can expect an increasing number of cities to look at piloting smart delivery zones. There's a number of issues that are covered in the slides that mean that pilots are a good way to actually deal with those issues and get the scheme configured. And the second thing is that we're thinking about using, offering to users who frequently use the curbside a highly convenient access, which that convenience should be the key to unlocking the monetization of the value of a easy to use service over a basic level of service where the user has to type in each time the digital code of the zone. So freemium is the way to go forward, we think. We've been lucky to get some money from the European Commission to look at a market study. Obviously, there are other approaches that we've seen, and we can discuss those perhaps in another webinar. But it's clear that local authorities are learning how to configure services that actually make the curbside useful. And we advocate a solution which offers various grades of curbside access. This is a way of unlocking the value, as well as, and I think that's the key point of the presentation. So we are keen that 4448 supports different grades of curbed access as a way of making sure that it covers that thing. Thanks for listening. That's it.
Great, thanks very much, Simon. That's really good. We are very out of time, I think, really. But thanks to our panelists. I'm sorry, Simon, we're not going to get round to answering specific questions for you, but where questions are put in the chat, we will try to answer them and get the messages and get the answers out to people over the next few days. The video of this will also be available on YouTube before the weekend as well. So thank you to our panelists, and also to our audience as well. And I'll just hand you back to Jerry just for a final word.
Thank you very much, Alana, and thanks everybody for being with us today. You know, we're using technology to communicate with you, and sometimes it doesn't always work. And so that just kind of highlights the challenge and the importance of what we're dealing with in automation and monetizing the curb in the age of automation. So we're going to share slides that are appropriate with all registrants as well. We're going to send a copy of the video, and just thank you all so much for being with us today. Thank you to all the panelists, and we'll look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. Thanks, everyone.